Jesse Ventura was the loudest man in professional wrestling. The bandanas and the booming voice and the catchphrases that bounced off arena rafters. To the fans watching at home in the 1980s, he was Jesse the Body Ventura, the most outrageous talker the business had ever produced. A man who turned color commentary into an art form, sitting next to a wide-eyed announcer and saying the quiet part out loud. But behind all the noise, behind the spectacle, Jesse Ventura was the one man in that entire industry who looked at Vince McMahon and saw exactly what he was. And he tried to warn everybody. Nobody listened. This is the story of how, 40 years ago, a wrestler stood on a locker room bench and told a room full of his peers that the man signing their checks was getting rich off their broken bodies while giving them nothing in return. No health insurance, no pension, no union, no safety net of any kind. He told them they had power if they used it together. He told them that if they stood up as one, McMahon would have no choice but to listen. And he was right. The wrestlers had all the leverage in the world that night. They had the biggest event of the year hanging in the balance. They could have changed the entire business with a single word. Instead, they got scared. They went home. And one of them, the biggest star of them all, walked straight into Vince McMahon's office and gave Jesse Ventura up. What followed was 40 years of consequences. A union that never came. A court case that proved McMahon had lied. A revelation dragged out under oath that exposed the friend who had betrayed him. And finally, decades later, a collapse so complete, so sordid, that even Ventura's harshest warnings started to look like understatements. Because the man Jesse Ventura tried to warn everyone about in 1986 would eventually walk away from the company he built under a cloud of allegations so dark that his own creation had to pretend he never existed. This is the story of the warning nobody wanted to hear. And to understand why it mattered so much, you have to understand who Jesse Ventura actually was. Because he was never going to be the kind of man who kept his mouth shut. James George Llanos was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1951, the son of working-class parents who had both served in the military during the Second World War. That working-class background mattered. It shaped everything about him. After high school, he enlisted in the United States Navy and served in the underwater demolition teams, the units that would later evolve into the modern Navy SEALs. He served during the Vietnam War era, and the experience left him with a particular kind of toughness and a particular kind of attitude. This was a man who had been trained to operate under pressure, to trust the men beside him, and to never back down from anyone. When he came home, he rode with a motorcycle club for a time before finding his way into professional wrestling in the mid-1970s. He reinvented himself as Jesse the Body Ventura, building a character around pure arrogance and attitude. He bleached his hair, wore the most outrageous outfits he could find, and talked an endless stream of trash. He was never the most technically gifted wrestler in the world, and he knew it. But he understood something most wrestlers never figured out. He understood that the talking was the product, the character was the product, and nobody talked better than Jesse. A blood clot in his lungs eventually cut his in-ring career short, but it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to him. McMahon, who had a genius for spotting talent even in people he would later come to despise, put Ventura behind the announce desk. And there, sitting beside the wholesome play-by-play men, Jesse became a sensation. He was the villain's voice, the guy who always took the bad guy's side, who mocked the heroes and celebrated the rule breakers. He was sharp, he was funny, and he was utterly fearless about saying things that made the company uncomfortable. He commentated on the biggest shows of the decade. He was a genuine star. But here is the thing about Jesse Ventura that McMahon may not have fully appreciated when he hired him. Ventura did not think like a wrestler. He thought like a man who had seen how the rest of the world worked, and he could not unsee the difference. By the mid-1980s, he had started doing work in Hollywood. He would soon land a memorable role in the action film Predator, sharing the screen with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And in Hollywood, Jesse learned something that would change the course of his life. He learned about residuals. He learned about royalties. He learned that when an actor performed in something, and that something got sold and resold and played again and again, the actor got paid every single time. There were unions that made sure of it. There were rules. There was protection. Then he would go back to the wrestling business and find none of that. None of it. And he started asking a very dangerous question. Why not? To understand why that question was so dangerous, you have to understand the machine Vince McMahon had built. In the early 1980s, he took over the wrestling promotion his father had run and did the unthinkable. He tore up the old gentleman's agreement that kept promoters in their own territories, went national, raided the best talent from every corner of the country, put wrestling on cable television, and created WrestleMania. By the time of WrestleMania 2 in 1986, McMahon was sitting on top of an empire that was printing money. But the men who made that money, the wrestlers themselves, were not employees. They were independent contractors, and that single classification was the foundation of everything. Because an independent contractor is not entitled to the protections that ordinary workers take for granted. No company health insurance, no pension plan, no workers' compensation if you got hurt on the job, no unemployment benefits if the company cut you loose, no paid time off, no right to organize. The wrestlers paid their own travel, their own medical bills, their own everything, while performing one of the most physically destructive jobs on the planet, night after night, with no off-season and no guarantees. And the cruelest part of the arrangement was this. McMahon controlled every aspect of their working lives the way an employer controls an employee. He decided when and where they wrestled. He decided who won and who lost. He scripted their characters and their words. By any reasonable measure of how the law defines a real employee, these men were employees in everything but name. But on paper, they were independent businessmen, contractors who just happened to have one client who controlled their entire existence. It was a setup that saved McMahon an enormous amount of money and stripped the wrestlers of nearly every protection a worker could have. Most of the wrestlers either did not understand this or were too afraid to say anything about it. Jesse Ventura understood it completely. And he was not afraid. The spark came, as these things often do, by pure chance. Ventura would later tell the story many times. He was in an elevator one day when he ran into Gene Upshaw, the great offensive lineman for the Oakland Raiders, who had become the head of the National Football League Players Association. Upshaw was a union man through and through, a leader who had fought for the rights of professional athletes. He looked at Ventura, this big wrestling star, and according to Jesse, he raised a finger and told him something simple and direct. He told Jesse that the wrestlers needed to form a union. Those words landed on exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. Ventura had already seen how Hollywood protected its performers through the Screen Actors Guild. He had already started wondering why everything he did for the movie business earned him residuals while everything he did for the wrestling business earned him nothing once the check cleared. And now here was a respected union leader telling him plainly that what wrestlers needed was to organize. The idea took root. And Jesse Ventura was not a man who let an idea sit quietly. He started doing the math. He started thinking about leverage. And he realized that there was no better moment to make a stand than the one that was coming up. WrestleMania 2, scheduled for April of 1986, was the most ambitious event the company had ever attempted. It was going to be staged across 3 separate cities at once, in New York, in Chicago, and in Los Angeles. It was a massive logistical gamble, and it depended entirely on the wrestlers showing up and performing. Without them, there was no show. With the whole world watching and millions of dollars on the line, the men McMahon classified as disposable independent contractors actually held all the cards. If they refused to go on, McMahon would have no choice. He would have to come to the table. He would have to negotiate. And the thing the wrestlers wanted most, the thing that would change their lives, was the one thing McMahon would never give them willingly: a union. So Ventura made his move. In a locker room, with no agents and no management around, he gathered the boys together. By his own account, he stood up in front of them and delivered a speech. He told them the truth as he saw it. He told them they were being taken advantage of. He told them they were the ones taking the bumps, the ones whose bodies were being destroyed, the ones generating fortunes for a man who gave them nothing in return. And he told them that if they stood together, if they refused to perform at WrestleMania 2, unless McMahon agreed to real demands, they could finally get what they deserved. They could get a union. They could get protection. They could change the business forever. It was a genuinely revolutionary moment. For one night, in one locker room, the most exploited workers in American entertainment were being told the simple, powerful truth that together they had power. And some of them felt it. You could see the idea catching. But then came the hesitation. The first thing several of the wrestlers said was that they could not do this without Hulk Hogan. Hogan was the biggest star in the company, the face of the entire boom, the man whose name sold out arenas. The other wrestlers felt they needed him on board for any of this to work. And Ventura, who had thought this through more carefully than anyone, disagreed completely. He told them they did not need Hogan at all. He pointed out that all they really needed was King Kong Bundy, who was Hogan's opponent at the main event. If Bundy agreed not to perform, the marquee match collapsed on its own. And from there, Ventura argued, they could reach out to the wrestlers down in the rival promotion in Charlotte and get them to walk out too. If everyone moved together across companies, the whole structure would have to bend. They could finally win. It was a smart plan. It was the right plan, and it was about to be destroyed before it ever had a chance. The very next day, Jesse Ventura was at home when his phone rang. It was Vince McMahon. And McMahon was furious. Ventura would describe the conversation many times over the years, and the gist never changed. McMahon demanded to know what Ventura thought he was doing, stirring up union talk in the dressing room. He read Ventura the riot act. He made it absolutely clear that if Ventura ever so much as mentioned the word union again, he would be finished. The threat was naked and total, and Ventura, being Ventura, stood up to him. He pushed back. He asked McMahon why they could not have a union, why the wrestlers should not have the same protections that performers in every other corner of the entertainment world enjoyed. But the conversation had already told him everything he needed to know about what had just happened. Because here was the detail that haunted him. The meeting in the locker room had been just the boys. No management, no office, no agents. It was supposed to be wrestlers only, a private conversation among peers. And yet, less than a day later, McMahon knew everything. He knew about the speech, he knew about the plan, he knew it all. Somebody in that room had run straight to the boss. McMahon did not stop with one phone call. According to accounts from wrestlers who were there, he went down the roster one by one. He called the wrestlers individually, and he delivered a chillingly simple message. He told them he knew about the meeting, and he told them that anybody who showed up to organize, anybody who pushed this union idea forward, would not have a job in the morning. It was a masterclass in how to crush a movement. Pick the workers off one at a time, in private, where they cannot draw strength from each other. Make the threat personal, make the fear individual, and watch the solidarity evaporate. It worked perfectly. The momentum that had been building in that locker room died overnight. The wrestlers who had felt the spark of possibility now felt only the cold reality of their situation. They had families to feed. They had careers that lived or died at McMahon's pleasure. They were independent contractors with no protection and no leverage if they got blacklisted. The risk was simply too great, and McMahon had made sure each of them faced it alone. Nobody showed up. The union died before it was ever born. Ventura, for his part, had a cushion that most of the others did not. He had his Hollywood career. He had options. He was not entirely dependent on McMahon for his survival, which is exactly why he had the freedom to stand up in that locker room in the first place. But that freedom also meant he had less to lose by simply letting it go. And so, with the movement crushed and his peers too frightened to fight, Ventura made a decision. If the wrestlers were not willing to stand up for their own rights, then he would look out for himself. He dropped the union idea. The moment had passed. But the betrayal stayed with him, because Jesse Ventura knew with absolute certainty that somebody had sold him out. There had been a stooge in that locker room, an informant who had carried his words straight to Vince McMahon to score points with the boss. In the old wrestling business, there was no lower thing a man could be than an office stooge, somebody who ratted out his fellow wrestlers to curry favor with management. It violated the most basic code of the locker room, and someone had done exactly that to Jesse. For years, he did not know who. He suspected various mid-level wrestlers. He turned it over in his mind. But he had no proof, and the wrestling business was full of people who would never admit to something like that. It became a wound that never quite healed, a question without an answer. Who had betrayed him? Who had killed the union? Who had handed Vince McMahon the ammunition he needed to destroy the best chance those wrestlers ever had? The answer would come years later, from the most unexpected source imaginable, from Vince McMahon himself. Under oath, by the late 1980s, the relationship between Ventura and the company had begun to fray for other reasons. Ventura left as a full-time commentator and chased his Hollywood career, then returned for periods, then drifted again. He worked for the rival promotion for a while, and along the way, he discovered something that made his blood boil. He discovered that the company had been selling videotapes of its events. Tapes that featured his commentary, his voice, his face, all over them. And he was not getting paid a dime for any of it. This was the residuals issue all over again, the exact thing his Hollywood experience had trained him to recognize. He knew that his work had value, that his voice on those tapes was part of what people were paying for, and that in any fair arrangement, he would be compensated for the continued sale of his work. He went back and looked at how it had happened, and what he found was infuriating. Back in 1987, when he had been negotiating his commentator contract, he had been told that the company simply did not pay royalties on videotapes, that it was against policy, that the only people who received such royalties were the feature performers, the top stars. Believing this, Ventura had signed a contract waiving his right to those royalties. Why fight for something that nobody got? Except that was not true. Ventura eventually learned that other performers, people who were not feature stars, were in fact receiving royalties on those tapes. He had been told something false during his contract negotiation, and he had given up real money based on that false information. So in late 1991, Jesse Ventura did the thing that wrestlers were never supposed to do. He sued Vince McMahon. The case was filed against Titan Sports, the corporate entity behind the wrestling company, in Minnesota State Court. Ventura's claims included fraud, the misappropriation of his publicity rights, and a legal principle called quantum meruit, which essentially holds that a person deserves to be paid the reasonable value of services they provided. He asked for $2 million in royalties, calculated on the fair market value of his work. The company moved the case into federal court, where these things often go when corporations want a different venue, and then it went to trial in front of a jury. The result was a stunning rebuke of Vince McMahon. The jury found that Titan had defrauded Jesse Ventura. They awarded him $801,333 to compensate him for the company's exploitation of his commentary on videotapes. They awarded him additional money for the use of his name, voice, and likeness on other merchandise. A jury of ordinary people had looked at the evidence and concluded that Vince McMahon's company had lied to one of its performers in order to cheat him out of what he was owed. The company appealed all the way up the chain. The judgment was affirmed by the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. McMahon tried to take it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the highest court in the land declined to even hear it, which meant the verdict stood. Jesse Ventura had beaten Vince McMahon in federal court, and there was nothing McMahon could do about it. It was court-ordered. The company's response was as petty as it was telling. Rather than simply paying Ventura his royalties on future releases, the company went back through its archive and began scrubbing his commentary off its home video products. His voice was edited out of release after release, erased from the historical record of events he had been a central part of. But the lawsuit had done something far more important than win him money. It had put Vince McMahon under oath. And that changed everything. Because during the legal process, during a deposition, Jesse Ventura finally got the chance to ask the question that had been eating at him for years. Through his attorney in that deposition, the lawyer asked McMahon a direct question. Had anyone ever tried to form a wrestlers' union? And McMahon, answering under oath, remembered that yes, Ventura himself had once tried to do exactly that. Then came the follow-up. The lawyer asked McMahon how he had known about it. And Vince McMahon, with no apparent hesitation, gave up the answer that Ventura had been chasing for the better part of a decade. Hulk Hogan had told him. It was Hogan, the biggest star in the business, the man Ventura had publicly insisted they did not even need for the union to succeed. The friendly rival on television, the supposed brother in the locker room, the icon who preached his gospel of training and prayers and clean living to millions of children. He had been the stooge. While the other wrestlers were debating whether they could move without him, Hogan had quietly gone straight to McMahon and told him that Ventura was stirring things up, that he was trying to start a union, that there could be a walkout at the biggest show of the year. He would later describe it in his own words as being on McMahon's team all the way. Ventura was flawed. He had suspected a lot of people over the years, but to hear it confirmed directly from McMahon in a legal deposition about the most famous man in the entire industry was something else entirely. The betrayal had a face now, and it was the most recognizable face in wrestling history. Ventura never forgave him. For the rest of both their lives, he refused to bury the hatchet. Decades later, he would still talk about it with a hard edge in his voice, still name Hulk Hogan as the man who cut his legs out from under him, the man who killed the union and, by extension, cost an entire generation of wrestlers the protections they might have won. When asked years afterward whether he would ever reconcile, whether he would even speak to Hogan, Ventura's answer was a flat refusal. He said Hogan had betrayed him and he wanted an apology that he knew would never come. Hogan, for his part, spent years denying he had done it before finally admitting the truth on camera in a documentary, by which point the wound had long since calcified into permanent contempt. But here is what matters about all of this, the thing that elevates it beyond a personal grudge between two old wrestlers. Jesse Ventura had been right. Not just about Hogan, about everything. He had been right that the wrestlers were being exploited. He had been right that they had power if they used it together. He had been right that Vince McMahon would lie to protect his money, and a federal jury proved it. And he had been right about the single biggest scam in the entire business, the independent contractor classification that stripped wrestlers of every protection a worker should have. That issue did not go away when the union died. It festered for decades. Ventura would later say that Vince McMahon was lucky he never ran for the United States Senate, Because if he had, he would have launched a senatorial investigation into why professional wrestlers were being called independent contractors when they so obviously were not. He was not exaggerating the problem. In the years that followed, the question of how wrestlers were classified would come up again and again. Former wrestlers filed lawsuits arguing they had been deliberately misclassified, that the company exercised so much control over their lives that they were employees in every real sense, and that the independent contractor label was a scheme to dodge legal obligations and save money. They pointed out that they had been denied workers' compensation, health insurance, and the basic safeguards that workers in other industries took for granted. Some of these former wrestlers, who had given their bodies and their long-term health to the business, said they had been left to deal with devastating injuries and their consequences entirely on their own. And the most damning fact of all, the fact that proves Ventura's warning landed on deaf ears, is this. To this day, there is still no union in professional wrestling. 40 years after Jesse Ventura stood on that bench and told his fellow wrestlers they deserved better, the men and women who perform in that industry still largely operate as independent contractors. The exact problem he tried to fix in 1986 remains the structure of the business in the present day. The newer wrestling companies that have risen to challenge the empire have faced the very same accusations of misclassifying their talent. Nothing fundamental changed. The warning was real, the solution was right there, and the industry simply refused to take it. That alone would make Jesse Ventura a prophet. But the story does not end with labor law and royalty checks, because the deepest part of Ventura's warning was never really about the money. It was about the man. It was about a person who would lie to your face to save $1, who would threaten your livelihood the moment you challenged him, who would control every aspect of the people who depended on him, and who would crush anyone who dared to suggest that those people deserved dignity and protection. Ventura saw that character clearly in 1986, and 40 years later, the world would see it too, in a way that was far darker than anyone could have predicted. By the 2020s, Vince McMahon sat atop an entertainment empire larger than anything he could have dreamed of in the 1980s. The company he built had merged with the parent organization that also owned the biggest name in mixed martial arts, forming a publicly traded giant worth billions. McMahon was its executive chairman. He had outlasted every rival, survived every controversy, and beaten back every challenge to his control, including a federal trial in the 1990s on charges related to providing performance-enhancing substances to his wrestlers. A trial that ended in his acquittal. He seemed untouchable. He seemed permanent. He had spent 4 decades proving that the rules that applied to other people did not apply to him. And then, in January of 2024, it all came apart. A former employee of the company filed a lawsuit in federal court in Connecticut. The allegations it contained were among the most disturbing ever leveled at a major American executive. The woman accused McMahon of sexual abuse and of trafficking her to other men, including another senior figure in the company. The lawsuit described a pattern of degradation and exploitation, and alleged that company property and company resources had been involved. It was a document so graphic and so damning that the entire wrestling world reeled. McMahon denied the allegations completely. He called the lawsuit a collection of lies and made-up incidents and a vindictive distortion of the truth, and he said he intended to defend himself and clear his name. He has not been criminally charged in connection with the allegations in that suit, and the legal process surrounding it has continued to unfold. But the damage was instantaneous and total. Within roughly a day of the lawsuit becoming public, Vince McMahon resigned from the company he had built and from the larger corporation that owned it. The man who had controlled every detail of that empire for 40 years, who had crushed a union and erased a commentator's voice from videotapes and ruled his locker room through fear, was gone. The company moved quickly to distance itself from him. The following year, McMahon reached a settlement with federal securities regulators over allegations that he had failed to properly disclose payments he had made, agreeing to financial penalties in that matter. The co-defendant in the trafficking lawsuit eventually agreed to cooperate with the woman who had sued and reached his own settlement with her. Think about what that means in the context of everything Ventura had said. In 1986, he tried to tell a room full of wrestlers that the man in charge of their lives could not be trusted, that he saw them as resources to be used rather than people to be protected, that he would do whatever it took to maintain his control and his profits regardless of the human cost. They did not believe him, or they were too afraid to act on it. Hulk Hogan went and protected the boss. The wrestlers went home. The union died, and 40 years later, that same man walked away from his empire amid allegations that he had treated a human being as something to be used and traded for his own benefit. Jesse Ventura was not claiming to predict the specific horrors of that final chapter. No one could have. But the thread that runs through the entire 40-year story is the same thread he identified at the very beginning. It is a story about power without accountability. It is a story about a man who controlled everything and answered to no one. In an industry with no union, no oversight, and no protection for the people inside it. Ventura had pointed at the exact structural problem that allows that kind of unchecked power to exist. He was talking about royalties and health insurance and pensions in 1986. But the underlying truth, that an industry with no accountability gives its most powerful figure license to do as he pleases, turned out to be the truest thing anyone ever said about the business. And there is one final bitter note to the whole saga. Hulk Hogan, the man who betrayed Ventura and killed the union, died in the summer of 2025 at the age of 71. He passed away at his home in Florida from a heart attack, having battled several serious health conditions. The rift between him and Ventura was never repaired. The apology Ventura had demanded never came. The two men, once partners in the spectacle that built McMahon's fortune, went to their separate ends as estranged adversaries, divided forever by a betrayal in a locker room nearly 4 decades earlier. Jesse Ventura, meanwhile, lived a life that proved he had been something more than just a loudmouth in a feather boa all along. After wrestling, he went into politics and shocked the entire country by getting elected governor of Minnesota, running as an outsider who answered to no party and no establishment. He proved that the man who had stood up in that locker room and challenged the most powerful figure in his industry was exactly who he appeared to be. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Was Jesse Ventura the only honest man in the building? And who do you want us to cover next? Like and subscribe. Until next time.